The Elephant Road. And we are up to chapter 9. As village leaders, mother and father called a meeting to discuss the loss of the majority of the rice crop. Everyone would come to Nokma's house for a meal in the evening and talk. So Mother, Auntie Em, and Auntie Mama spent all of the next day cooking. Mother's big pots came down off the shelves and a fire was lit in the yard to cook on, as not everything would fit on the kitchen stove. Wyland, Relip, and the twins were kept busy peeling and chopping, washing pots, and fetching water. Father, Rengu, and Dax, with Grandpa giving instructions, put up a shelter of bamboo and thatch so that everyone could sit around and eat together without getting rained on. Dengu was mentioned for the first time in weeks, and Nambat was asked to call him on his mobile phone. Nambat's phone always worked as he rigged up a way to charge it at the solar lantern station in his parents' house. Everyone was very glad to sit down around the fire and eat Mother's delicious food. But when it came, the talk grew pretty gloomy. Wyland listened to all the voices around him like little strands of the same sad story. We won't be eating rice this time next year. If the rains wash another lot of seedlings away, I won't have a single eggplant to sell at harvest time. I'll have to leave the hum fields and get a job in town if things aren't better next year. Wyland saw his mother and father exchanging worried looks. Mother whispered in her husband's ear and he nodded. As usual, she was telling him what he needed to say. Slowly, Father looked around at all the faces, taking them in. Everyone fell silent. We've had a setback, that's true, he said. But young people like Nambat here shouldn't have to think about leaving. It's true that our yields have been failing, and it's true that we seem to be having more problems with elephants. But all we need are a few extra ways to make our land pay. Egg production, for instance, and honey. That's all very well, Batman interrupted, but where do we get a chicken house big enough? You need proper hives to keep bees, added Nambat. It all takes money, said Rengu, and we don't have any, brother-in-law. Well, said a voice from the shadowy doorway. It looks like that's where I come in. Dengu stepped into the light. He seemed to have gotten taller and more handsome since they had seen him last. He was dressed from top to toe in shiny black biker's leathers. He looked even more like a movie star than ever. Wyland wondered if he had bought an even bigger motorbike. Everyone stared at Dengu, open-mouthed. Grandpa was the first to speak. Well, you've made yourself scarce in all our troubles, Dengu, he growled. Father looked Dengu up and down. You certainly seem to be doing well for yourself. I've been working for you and for Umiyamara all this time, Dengu replied. I've been finding better solutions to your problems than a few chickens or some pesky beehives. Dengu had always been cheeky, but this level of rudeness took everyone's breath away. Dengu simply took advantage of the silence and continued. I've been working to make a deal for you, even better than the deal that I set up at Gorapunji's coal depot. If it's anything that has to do with coal, Grandpa snapped, we don't want to know. Not coal, Dengu snapped back. It's pineapples and tea. My business partner is willing to take as much as you can grow. He'll be here any minute and he'll tell you himself. Dengu had it well planned. The words were scarcely out of his mouth when a huge black 4x4 lumbered its way into the village. Wyland recognized it at once. A man with pale skin and fat hands got out of the back of the vehicle. He introduced himself as Dengu's business partner, Dawkey Patchep. He smiled a great deal and shook hands with all the grown-ups. His driver gave out small presents, packets of snacks and sweets and teas and soap. Mr. Patchap sat down like a king coming to be crowned and started talking. He talked about the money people in the other villages had made and showed them photographs on a computer of the new houses and roads that doing business with him had brought them. A bright future for them and their children was within the grasp. All they had to do was clear their forest and grow crops for him. Of course, Mr. Patchep added, smiling, I will provide chemicals to keep your crops free of pests, all pests. He hit a button on the computer and a picture of a dead elephant popped up on the screen. After the loss of their rice crop, no one in Umamara liked elephants very much, but all the same, an uneasy murmur passed around the fire at a sight of a poisoned dead elephant. Dengu's eyes blazed. Why are you so sentimental? Dengu said. Elephants ruin your livelihood. The forest doesn't pay its way. What could be simpler? Get rid of the forest and the elephants and be rich instead of poor. All this time, Grandfather sat quietly, like a pot slowly coming to a boil. But now he struck the ground with his stick. Sparks flew off the stones. A terrible silence followed. Wyland felt it on his skin, like the cold sweat of a fever. Grandpa stepped up to Dengu so that they faced each other in the firelight. How could a son of mine be so stupid? Grandfather roared. The forest gives us everything. Our homes, our medicine, the water we drink. The elephants and the gibbons are a part of the forest, just as we are. This forest gives us our soul, but maybe you don't have a soul anymore, Dengu. They were almost nose to nose. Their two faces were silhouetted against the fire. They were so alike. They were so furiously angry. Wyland thought they might hit each other. Mother stepped in between them, and she spoke to Dengu in a voice that was cold and hard as stone. Step aside, brother. Let our father pass, she said. For a moment, Dengu just stared defiantly into his father's face. Then he dropped his eyes and did as his sister had asked. Grandpa walked out and into the dark. Dengu then turned to speak to the whole village. Make up your minds, he said, and quickly. Mr. Pachap and I will return in 2 weeks to hear your decision. The big black car bumped off down the track. The moment it was gone, the villagers began to talk very loudly. Mother whispered in Father's ear again and urged him forward. Quiet, everyone, Father shouted. We all need to think about this very carefully. Whatever happens, we must not let this create quarrels. We must come to a decision that we all agree upon. Far into the night, every house in Umanmara was filled with talk. Wyland could hear his parents whispering. They sounded like a hissing barrel of snakes. He tossed and turned, his thoughts swirling in his head. Keep still, said Relip. I can't, breathed Wyland. Then tell me, brother, who is right, Grandpa or Uncle Dengu? That was just what Wyland had been trying to figure out himself. Grandpa was right. The forest did give them so much. But if they couldn't grow enough food to live on, then what could they do? Poisoning elephants was horrible. But if elephants ate crops, then people would starve. What's the answer, Wyland? Relip asked. I don't know, Wyland answered miserably. I don't know. Okay, chapter 10. Volcanoes, when they erupt, don't explode just once, but several times. 2 days after the elephants destroyed the rice crop, Umamara experienced another, more terrible eruption. The warning was announced on the radio at lunchtime. A tropical cyclone that the weather forecaster had named Isabella was heading their way. It raced over the Bay of Bengal and would reach their hills by the evening. Everyone was sent home from school. As Wyland walked up the track to Umamara with his cousins and the other high school kids, the sky to the south was turning purple and yellow like a big bruise. Toka looked over his shoulder and let out a whistle. Wow, there she is, Isabella. She certainly is ugly. I've never seen a sky like that before. Everyone stopped to look, and then Without another word, they all turned and began to run up the track. Mother was shoving chickens into a basket, like much dirty washing, to keep them from being blown away. Father was leading the cow and her calf into the dining room because the rain shelter where the animals usually spent the night was not secure enough for this kind of weather. Relip tugged on the pig's rope, trying to persuade the pig to go inside too. "Thank goodness you're home," said Mother. "Quick, take this ladder to Auntie Batma and Uncle Simbal and help them take the solar panels down." Auntie Batmy was wringing her hands with worry. "Nambat is with his wife's family today, and Cybele is in town. I hope they are taking shelter somewhere." Wyland smiled at her and managed to say, "Yes, I'm sure they'll be okay," in a voice he hoped was loud enough to be heard. Batma and Cybele ran to the solar recharging station for the village lanterns, but Auntie was too old and wobbly to get up the ladder, so Wyland went up for her. The wind was already shrieking in the trees, and it took all of Wyland's strength to unscrew the panels and lift them down from the pole. There he is. "You are tougher than you look, Wyland," Auntie said. "Now, get home. The storm is almost here." The rain stung like sharp stones as it hit Wyland's skin, and the wind tried its best to peel him off the ground and send him skittering off like a leaf. He clung to the trees and then he crawled on the ground. It took him a half an hour to get home from Auntie Batma's house, a journey that he usually skipped along in 5 minutes. When he got back, Father pulled him through the door of the sleeping house. "I was just about to see if you had blown away, son." He looked more pleased to see Wyland than he had in a year. It was dark in the hut. Father lit the stub of a candle in a jar. They needed to save the lanterns, as they had no idea how long the storm would last. In the flickering light, Wyland could see Relip sitting in the corner with the basket of clucking hens, and Mother on the bed feeding Nono. "Where's Grandpa?" Wyland breathed. "He's out in the forest," said Mother. "He's collecting medicine plants for Nono's cough." "Don't worry," said Father. "He knows many safe places to shelter from any storm." But their reassuring voices didn't hide the fear they had on their faces. Night came, but no one slept. The house rocked and creaked as if a whole herd of elephants was roaring at it. Through the roaring rush of the wind and rain came sounds of tearing and falling as the storm ripped branches and leaves from the trees and threw them down on the ground. Then, not long before dawn, came a terrible new noise. A kind of roaring and crashing, but so loud and on such an enormous scale that it was impossible to imagine what it could mean. All Wyland and his family could do was cling together and endure the vast breaking waves of sound. The ground shook under their feet. "Is it the end of the world?" Relip whispered. Wyland thought it might be too, so he just held his little brother until it was all over. Chapter 11. Sometime in the morning, when the sun was a watery patch of gray sky over the hilltops, the family came out of their house. Wyland's first thought was that their hut had somehow been blown to a new place, to a hillside they had never seen before. Their kitchen hut and Grandpa's little house beyond it had simply gone, as if they never existed at all. And in their place was a vast, muddy gash. It looked as if giants of all giants have dug a hole and then flung mud and rocks in a river of devastation down the hill. It's like a crack. Now they understood the meaning of the noise they heard in the night. Relip buried his head in his mother's skirts, and Wyland stood very, very close to his father. "A mudslide," Father said quietly. "Another few meters, and we would have been swept away." "We must check on everyone," said Mother. "Yes," Father replied, "and assess the damage, notify the authorities." Wyland looked at his parents. Although they were pale with shock and exhaustion, they were already thinking of their roles as Nokmas, the leaders of the village. They would be taking care of the village, which meant that he would have to take care of looking for Grandpa. When his parents went off around the village with Relip and Nono, Wyland offered to stay behind in case Grandpa came back, but as soon as they were out of sight, he set off to find him. He climbed down the side of the giant pit into the surface of the mudslide, and then he picked his way over a jumble of rocks and soil and torn up trees. Half of the hill on which his home stood had simply collapsed, destroying the whole beetle nut plantation, his mother's orange trees, and one of the biggest of the village's plots. That's like a garden where they grow things. The debris had blocked the stream and almost filled the valley, changing the landscape for humans and elephants too. What would they make of it if they had to come back this way? Wyland picked his way over the rocks and mud, searching for any sign of huts or animals. Surely the mudslide had cut through at least 6 of the 7 layers that separated ordinary life from the underworld. Perhaps Sandkini would stick 2 heads out of the debris. It cheered Wyland to think of that, to remember grandfather's voice telling him stories and calling him nicknames. A soft moo made him look up. There, under a tree that dangled upside down by its roots, was their cow and her calf. Wyland ran towards them. They were covered in mud, and their eyes looked wild and frightened, but they seemed very glad to see him. Someone had tied the cow's halter to a branch with a twist of grass. Wyland's heart leapt. He felt sure that someone must have been Grandpa. He dived under the tangle of twigs to search for a sign. There was Grandpa's plant collecting bag, and there was Grandpa. He was streaked with mud and covered with cuts, and he had a big bruise on his forehead, but he was peacefully asleep, leaning against a rock. He must have somehow led the cow to safety and then sunk down, too tired to walk another step. Wyland knelt beside him, smiling, but when he took his grandfather's hand, he found that it was quite cold. His grandfather had died. Mother had to use Auntie M's stove to cook for the funeral feast. All the women helped out by bringing their biggest pots to replace the ones that Mother had lost in the mudslide. Uncle Rengu killed one of the surviving pigs, and the men and boys cut short lengths of bamboo to cook Grandpa's favorite meal, pork and ginger. Toka and Tika caught a load of little fish to cook with rice. Everyone who wasn't cooking was helping to rebuild what the cyclone had destroyed. Wyland escaped from all the bustle of the preparations and went off into the forest on his own. The green and quiet under the leaves comforted him. He knew Grandpa was gone, but here in the company of the great trees, he could still hear his grandfather's voice. Without the forest, who would we be? The forest gives us our soul. Wyland knew that Grandpa was right. He didn't like Mr. Patchap and the way he talked about killing elephants as if they were some pesky flies, and how cutting down the forest was like cutting down a patch of unruly grass. But Dengu was right too. They had to live, they had to eat, and now the cyclone had made that even more difficult than ever. Wyland buried his face in his hands. It was all too hard. Why couldn't things just stay the same? A breeze crept under the leaves and ruffled Wyland's hair. He looked up and saw a little plant with toothed leaves and a yellow flower caught in a shaft of sunlight. It was the plant that Grandpa had often shown him. But now, for the very first time, Wyland remembered what it was for. He picked 10 of its leaves and folded them carefully into his pocket. Then he ran back to the village and put the leaves into his mother's hands. "Oh, Wyland," she exclaimed, "how did you know? These are the healing leaves for Nono's cough." People came to the funeral feast for Grandpa from the villages all around, and the talking and singing went on for hours. Father and Dax had made a big bonfire, and everyone sat in the firelight and smoke and remembered Grandpa and the days gone past. He would have loved this, Mother said with tears in her eyes. A few days later, they scattered Grandpa's ashes in the only home field that the mudslide hadn't swept away. The rain spattered on the leaves and ran down their faces along with the tears. The only person who didn't cry was Dengu. He stared at the ashes, washing into the earth, and looked as if he might wash away too. Wyland stood beside him. He wanted to say something to make his uncle feel better, but he felt too bad himself to think of anything. Mother looked at her youngest brother and shook her head. I wish he hadn't quarreled, she said sad. I wish they hadn't quarreled, she said sadly. Father tucked Nono further inside his coat out of the rain. Try not to worry, he said. I have thought of an idea that might help. I wonder what his idea is. All right, so I'm going to stop there. We are up to chapter 12. We'll start from chapter 12. And there are chapter 12, chapter 13, and then there's an epilogue, and then there's a little bit more information. So got a little bit more to go.